Joseph, it's great to have you with us.
Good to be back.
So much has happened since the last time we talked.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
one of those things is these committees, the Task Force on Declassification, which is
Mhm.
run by Anna Paluna Luna there out of Florida, and Tim Burchett,
Mhm.
representative of Tennessee. And the idea was declassify all these documents relating to the JFK assassination.
Uh-huh.
They also included the RFK and MLK records in there, and a little spot at the end was, "Hey, you can give away all the UAP UFO secrets too. Let's have a committee."
Yeah.
So here's how it's been going. Every UFO hearing that they've scheduled, all the people who are supposed to show up get sick.
Oh,
They
no.
decide, and this is very interesting because they're coming in from different states, and they
Uh-huh.
say, "Oh, so and so got sick, oh, so we couldn't do it." So that's haven't had any of the UFO hearings. That's one. Darn. Two, when they have the JFK hearings, they don't know, unfortunately, any of the background. So you go round and around in this strangeness. The only good thing that happened was that they had Oliver Stone there, but he couldn't hear any of the questions going on for the most part.
Your tax
So,
dollars at work, ladies and gentlemen.
yeah, more audio visual issues with this committee than I've ever seen. But here's the real interesting thing. At the heart of the committee was the request to get all the records from the CIA, and supposedly they dumped all those records out, and some of them were interesting in a mild fashion.
Mhm.
The George Joannidis records, which are the key crucial records that you and I have followed, those never came out. And the CIA
No,
said you
gee,
don't
what
need
a
to have those.
surprise.
So here we are. No Joannidis records, and these task force kind of showroom congressional hearings. What is your impression on that? And isn't it kind of a constitutional crisis if there's an executive order that demands all the records from the CIA
Mhm.
and they just say, no, you can't have George Joannidis, who's their top psychological warfare officer who created the Oswald Project?
Well, I would go further. I'm not surprised, Daniel, but I would go further even than constitutional crisis, because what you have, if an agency is defying an executive order, just like the courts, are waging their own lawfare against the executive, what you have is a rogue agency.
Hmm.
And given the extent of their operations and rogueness over the past few decades, uh, what we have is a shell of a constitutional republic. We don't have it anymore. It's gone, and it's the sooner we face up to that, the better off we'll be. Um, but I'm not surprised, Daniel, at any of the shenanigans regarding these records or the JFK files or the CIA's UFO files. I'm not surprised at any of it. That agency is, I have, and I've shared this with you. I have my fantasy about the CIA. I call it Bastille Day version 2.0. My fantasy, it literally is a fantasy that I
Yes.
I have worked out in detail. Okay, my fantasy is that the people of this country just get so fed up that in their millions they all converge on Langley, Virginia, and storm the damn place
Oh, wow.
and take all those records and start passing them out. As it it is that much of a rogue agency, in my
Wow.
opinion. And it's going to take something like that to clean the damn thing out. um
It's amazing to still have that problem in
yep.
2025, and probably a larger problem than ever, actually.
Hmm.
When you think about the amount of employees and just that whole intelligence community in general, and then add on Homeland Security, you're talking
Yep.
about a massive, massive force.
You're
Last I
talking,
checked,
yeah, you're talking a rogue breakaway group just with the intelligence agencies, and I'm
yeah,
not even including UFOs or breakaway civilization idea. And the other part of it is that we've got to remember that, like all intelligence, quote unquote, communities, um, they have their networked connections to other intelligence agencies and to organized crime. So it's a festering pustule of malodorous crap is what it all is, and it needs to be lanced.
Well, you've emphasized before, just in the setup of the Central Intelligence Agency, you have a lot of German agents right at the beginning.
Yeah.
And so these people kind of showing up through the system, and then you have weird, along the way, the Alan Dulles group, with
Uh-huh.
Helms and everything, they have their own very strange connection to the whole Nazi
Oh,
uh,
totally.
outcome. Yeah.
Listen, I was just before we started the show, I was listening to a recent interview that just been posted between Tucker Carlson and Jeffrey Sachs.
Hmm.
And as I was listening to this, Sachs started talking about this business that's going on with the Ukraine bombing the Russian strategic bomber force.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That
Yeah. Hey, we're just gonna bomb your
yeah, we're
nuclear
just going to bomb
arsenal
your nuclear bombers, not meaning any, it's just us, we're just having a good old time here in Kiev. But anyway, Sachs actually mentioned the Nazi influence in the founding of the CIA, and mentioned General Galen,
Oh,
the
wow.
Nazi military intelligence chief, by
Yeah.
name. And then he said something that floored me. He said, and that group is still there and is still exercising influence. And I thought, well, welcome to the
Wow.
club, Jeffrey. you know, but that's a measure of how I think how what 10 years ago would never have been talked about on any media platform, much less by someone in his position.
Interesting. Maybe he's
Uh,
reading saucers, swastikas, and psyops.
who knows? I just welcome the fact that finally people are waking up that this has been a problem with that agency since its inception.
Yeah.
It's flirtations with fascism. I mean, look at the current Ukrainian government and tell me that that's not a neo-Nazi fascist government.
Yeah.
It is pure and simple, and it's doing typical neo-Nazi things like trying to win a war that it's brilliantly managing to lose by desperation measures. Uh,
Unbelievable.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's just unbelievable to me, and this whole thing needs to be reined in, Daniel, because it's a national security threat. These
Right.
people are mad. These people are insane. They want a war with Russia,
Yeah.
and that to me is like the very definition of insanity, because
Hmm.
that's not a war anybody's going to win. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. It's
It's just
Kennedy's fruits
yeah,
of victory will be ashes in our mouth.
yeah.
Um, Putin, he made a couple of interesting comments himself where
Mhm.
he was talking casually, and he said, well, the first ones who will burn in a conflict like that is Europe.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah.
And he goes into this whole thing and he's talking very kind of mildly. He said, well, they don't have missile defense. The United States does. We do. And he also said it in this weird way, like he knew it was way beyond that.
Yeah.
And that does bring me to this point, which is what we've been hearing about and what's been funded and what there's an executive order for a construction project underway for the Golden Dome. Joseph. And the Golden Dome is Star Wars 2. It's a missile defense program for the United States to screen out incoming ICBMs and shoot them out
Uh-huh.
based on this system. And Trump, as he likes to be very kind of colloquial and
Uh-huh.
direct about some of these things, he says, well, Reagan didn't have the technology then, but we do now. Of course, Reagan deployed a lot of it
Yeah,
in the
gee, golly
80s.
gosh. Listen, I was over in England at the time of all those Star Wars debates, finishing up my doctorate. And I literally remember this incident like yesterday. Like it was yesterday. I was in the Union Society bar having my pint and talking to some friends, and in rushes a mutual friend of ours with some news to share with everybody, as this hot debate about Star Wars is going on. And he informs us all that Edward Teller had just phoned President Reagan. Edward Teller, of course, being the American father of the hydrogen bomb, so not a slouch. Had just informed President Reagan that the test of their X-ray laser had been successful. Now, this was, I think, 83, 84, somewhere in there. Now, the idea of an X-ray laser is, imagine your typical X-ray machine, only it's in a nice tight collimated beam. This is the type of thing that you use not to drill a tooth, but to vaporize your head off your body. In other words, it's a really nasty piece of work. And of course, the big problem at that time was, well, Star Wars is talking about X-ray lasers and so on and so forth. But we've got to get them to work first, and then bang, the announcement came. So yeah, they've had the technology for a long time, but Putin. I go back to something that people may have forgotten here, and I think you're entirely correct, is we've had this stuff up in space for a long time. Anybody that thinks that space is not weaponized right now by the United States, by the Russian Federation, by the Chinese, the Brazilians, the Japanese, Indians, and anybody else who can put a satellite up into space, anybody who thinks it's not been weaponized is nuts.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you why. Back in 2013, remember what happened in Chelyabinsk?
Oh, yes.
The meteor.
Yeah.
1 month prior to that, then President Dmitry Medvedev got on Russian television and told the Russian television audience, well, we need an asteroid defense system, and we need to get everybody on board with this and make it an international effort. But if we can't get the Americans or the Chinese to go along with it, we're just going to have to go ahead and build it ourselves. Okay. And then the lady that was interviewing him says, well, how are we going to defend against asteroids? And he continues, a big smile on his face. He says, well, we've got all of our thermonuclear missiles, and we have other means of defending it. And he just left it at that. And of course, the reporterette didn't follow up with the essential question: what other means are we talking about here? And he just hung that out there. And then we get the Chelyabinsk meteor incident. And then a couple weeks after that, or before, I don't remember which, we had that strange incident of the Russian and American satellites that collided with each other. Remember that?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Now, Russia doesn't put up satellites to collide with anybody else's satellites, and neither do we.
Right.
Okay. So either one or both of us were testing our satellite collision weapons, or somebody else was moving our satellites to collide with each other. There's no other way to do this, folks.
Wow. So a third actor.
A third actor. Okay. Then let's go to the Tianjin chemical plant explosion outside of Beijing in China. Remember that?
Yes.
We had that big chemical plant explode. I did blogs on this, Daniel, because I thought, gee, that crater that was left where the chemical plant was, the crater there does not look like a crater from a chemical plant explosion, because the crater is narrow, conical, and deep. A crater from a chemical plant explosion is going to be wide and shallow. Okay. So this thing looks like literally a crater that was left from a hollow charge projectile, to be quite honest with you. In other words, it looks like a rod of God hit the dang place.
Yeah.
And that's the conclusion I came to, just examining the crater.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, yes, they've had these things up there for a long time. And the Golden Dome, I'll tell you why I think that this is all talk. It's not empty talk because the stuff exists, and I think it's up there now. I think we have entirely the wrong way of looking at these things. When they announce something, the technology is already there. It's already tested and perfected and operationally deployable. What the announcement is doing is acknowledging that fact. It's like Hitler's announcement or Hitler's order in 1944 authorizing the production of the vengeance weapons of the V2.
Oh
Well, the
yeah.
V2 had been in development and production for quite a long time, and it
It
actually
was.
started
Yeah.
in production in about 1942. So it's not an order to go ahead and develop this new weapon. What the order is, the weapon is developed, now go produce it, and we're going to use it. That's what's happening with Golden Dome. The
Mm-hmm.
technology exists, it's there. It's been operationally tested and deployed, as I think it has been. And what Trump's order is saying is we're going to kick the production of this into high gear. That's what I think it means.
Oh.
And
Yeah.
and just in the nick of time, because our good friends in Kiev have decided we're going to take the whole world down with us. And well, we better have something to defend against those Russian hypersonic missiles, and I sure hope the heck it works. you
Wow.
know
Wow.
uh
So they're trying to bluff us into using that
yeah,
extra curricular technology.
I think so.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Uh, oh, that's
Yeah,
very dangerous situation. And also the
yeah,
idea that they would provoke Russia so that we would have to get involved on
yeah,
that level, on a
yeah,
totally different level from sending them missiles here and there. It's
yeah.
such a provocative act. In fact, it's like the desperate move because they don't have any cards left to play.
It is the Ukrainian action to me is typical. It's the typical desperation move we've seen from Nazis, and this is a neo-Nazi regime after all.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
this is like watching. I in my book, The Third Way, I mentioned the Madrid Circular,
Mhm.
which was this Nazi document that was analyzing the strategic situation in the 1950s and concluding that the conflict between the Soviet Union and America would give them, meaning the Nazi international thing, maneuvering room. Well, that's what it looks like to me now.
Mhm.
I mean, the German government has absolutely lost its mind.
Yeah. Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
they're stationing troops in Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, and those countries have lost their mind too.
Yeah.
Uh, you know,
It's a NATO problem, basically.
it's a NATO problem. And look at the NATO logo. It's a very cleverly disguised swastika. You have to carefully consider it, but that's what it
Yeah,
is.
yeah, yeah.
It is a carefully disguised swastika. So I'm not a bit surprised at any of this. It is a desperation move. To his credit, being the only adult in the room, Mr. Putin has not taken the bait.
Mhm.
The Russians are going to do just exactly what they did in World War II. They're just going to slowly grind forward until there's nothing left to grind, and
Mm.
then it's all over. You
Yeah.
know, it's just,
Well, and Ukraine is not it's not gonna do anything without our support. I mean,
no.
we're the ones who give them the arms. They don't have anything practically.
We give them the arms, but more importantly, we give the intelligence. Those strikes against the Russian bomber fleet could not have been made without Western intelligence help at some point. So, whose intelligence? I don't know. Is it this rogue group in the clowns in America? I don't know. Is it the Bundesnachrichtendienst? I don't know. MI6? I don't know. Are any of them crazy enough to do something like that? You betcha.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, there's an interesting overlay here
Mhm.
because Russia, of course, has its own technology for a Golden Dome.
Yep.
We probably have more, maybe more intel, more scientific intel for it.
Mhm.
But it represents a huge shift of power, so that China instantly and Russia instantly said, no, 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 hell no, we won't glow. You're not going to put it up.
Uh-huh.
So where does that leave things? Because Trump is not only willing to put the Golden Dome up, but also we know there's a dual purpose for that. And the whole
Yes.
idea is, you know, you've got UFO technology, we have UFO technology. Ultimately, this is a UFO defense grid.
I think it's a UFO defense grid, and I think the other, I think that there are multiple layers and purposes to it. It's a UFO defense grid, certainly. It is a strategic defense, missile defense grid, certainly, but it's also a surveillance grid.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I think is key here is that for the kind of target determination and analysis that they would need to do for this, it is also part of the artificial intelligence agenda.
Oh.
To me, it's very interesting. I just did a blog about this on the website, Daniel. It's interesting that part of this, what I'm calling the big beautiful scam bill, the big beautiful bait and switch bill, is a 10-year moratorium on any state regulation of artificial
Oh,
intelligence.
yes.
Now
Yes.
stop and think. That's a whopper right there.
Yeah.
Uh, being the Confederate sympathetic person that I am, for state nullification and all of that. But they're literally trying to strip states of their right to regulate artificial intelligence. And I have to ask why, and why 10 years? Well, my suspicion is they need a window where they can perfect, and by the time the window closes, of course, it'll be too late for the states to regulate anything. And they need that window to get the AI part of this Golden Dome surveillance missile defense system in place. Um,
Hmm. So it starts
they're
calling the shot about what to shoot down.
right,
Yeah.
right. They need, particularly with Russia's development of hypersonic missiles, uh, they need a next generation ability for target acquisition and analysis of threats, particularly the ability to distinguish between, and this is the key point I think that people have to latch onto, particularly the ability to distinguish between a UFO and a hypersonic missile.
Mm.
That's key. That's
This
key.
is this is the same problem that JFK and Khrushchev tried to
Yes.
address. Yeah,
Yes.
which is let's
Exactly.
put something together so if one of these goes over one of your nuclear sites, it doesn't set off World War III.
Right. Right. Exactly. And what's his name? Richard Hastings, the guy that wrote that excellent book on UFOs and nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Let's not forget that both the Soviet Union and the United States have experienced UFO activity over their strategic missile defense sites.
Yes.
Um, you
Particularly
know,
in the Montana case is one of the
the
classics.
Montana case. Well, there was a case in the Ukraine at Bielokorovice during 1982, when Mr. Wonderful Yuri Andropov was premier of the Soviet Union. And in that case, the UFO actually started the countdown to launch on the Soviet missiles.
Oh,
And the
yeah, yeah.
Russians, were scrambling to shut this thing down before the missiles launched, which at a few seconds before the actual launch, the UFO stopped the countdown.
Amazing because well, Andropov probably had the most progressive UFO policy of them all,
Mm-hmm.
which is he said, "This is a national security issue. I want every piece scrap of UFO intel."
Well, that kind of incident will do that for you.
Yeah, yeah.
you know, uh, and I strongly suspect, if I remember correctly, that incident happened before Andropov gave that order. And the former head of the KGB is not going to just roll over and play dead after an
Yeah,
incident like that. So yeah,
yeah.
but this I think is what's driving a lot of this AI research right now, because everybody is going to put up their own version and update what they already have up there. in terms of the latest developments of nuclear missiles and so on. So all of this is wrapped together.
It's a brave new world of
Yep.
rolling out that advanced technology,
Yep.
which we haven't seen.
Yep.
Which we've heard about, and it's interesting. That national security advisor guy, Stephen Quast,
Mm-hmm.
when he came out recently and said, we have weapons that defy time and space.
Yep.
Speaking about the Trump administration, but then later he's on a Tucker Carlson podcast and he's going along doing his routine, and he says, we've had access to that technology ever since the Trump family got involved with the Tesla papers.
Yep.
And I was all right, this guy watched Tesla, Trump, and the time capsule, or is going through this?
The interesting thing there that I have a copy of that book about MIT and electronic developments, and it talks a great deal about John Trump and what his patents were.
Yes.
And there is a description of one of these patents, and when I read it, Daniel, I was
whoa, yeah.
What the patent suggested to me was they were trying to figure out a way to use vacuum technology to propagate plasma. Okay. So in other words, you have the Tesla broadcast system of power, which would be plasma. And the way that John Trump's patent read to me was that they were trying to find a way to use, quite literally, vacuum pipes as wires for electricity in the form of plasma. In other words, they could bend it, they could target it, they could collimate it in a beam.
Wow.
Yeah. That's a wow. That's a huge wow. This was Tesla's problem. So yeah, I can readily understand that Trump would be all gung ho for this. And the other thing that the surveillance aspect of this tells me is they're confident now with the developments in artificial intelligence and the Starlink system, the satellites and so on. They're confident now that they have the technology to monitor any proliferation attempts over this exotic energy technology. I go back to what I've said before. Tesla made it very clear in the 1910s and actually during World War I that his broadcast technology could be weaponized.
Right.
And it was a very, very simple technology to build once you understood what he was doing. It simply is reversing the ground load system circuitry of regular broadcasts. So in other words, the antenna becomes the planet Earth and the ground return is the atmosphere. It simply flips the radio circuit. Okay. What he does when he comes out and says this can be weaponized is he's creating a nightmare proliferation scenario. This is the reason that I think JP Morgan pulls the financial backing. It had nothing to do with not being able to meter the system, because Morgan stood to earn gazillions of dollars on the royalty and licensing fees alone to the technology. What they were concerned about was proliferation of the weaponization potential. Now, with the surveillance grid and artificial intelligence, they don't have that concern anymore. They can literally track everyone. This is the reason also that they're trying to put into place a digital central bank currency. They can track everybody's purchases.
Right.
So all of this is interconnected. All of it is interconnected. That's what people have to understand here. They're going to go ahead and do this. whether we like it or not. I ultimately think that it will be vastly and grotesquely unsuccessful.
Huh. The centralization with that kind of technology, forget it.
Oh,
You'll never
that
come back. Yeah.
well, the other problem is, okay, assume that we put up our golden dome. As you've pointed out, well, who's it really being put up for? Who's the target of it?
Yeah.
It's not Russia. It's not China.
Yeah.
It's Mr. E.T.
Yeah.
And Mr. E.T. may take a dim view of us little monkeys down here on this blue ball having that kind of technology and may come decide we're going to put a stop to it. It's the old Tower of Babylon,
Yes.
pardon me, Tower of Babel intervention
Babel.
scenario
Yes.
again. So
That's your Tower of Babel moment.
bingo, bingo.
Your own thesis there.
Yep,
Yes.
bingo. That's what they're worried
Um,
about.
yeah. And it's interesting too, because China and Russia fundamentally are saying, well, if you have a defense against that and we don't, you have the strategic advantage.
Uh-huh.
It's
Uh-huh.
not, and this is the same thing that came about because this goes back into Gorbachev of talking with Reagan at
Yep.
Reykjavik in 87, and Reagan saying, if we get attacked by
Will you help
these
us?
UFOs, will you help us? And Gorbachev on the record says, yeah, I told him that we would. So he was on board with it. Reagan's on board with it. That's a historical fact now. So where does that take us in thought? Because it's 40 years later, there's no real talk about that UFO defense grid. And I want to point this out because you mentioned Tesla, and I really want your kind of deep analysis on this. And I'll make it short, but recently I did an episode all about John Trump and Tesla.
Mm-hmm.
And, as you know, I like to do those types of episodes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's the thing. In this one, I was citing a kind of rare book I mentioned to you called Surreptitious Entry by Willis George. Willis George was this OSS guy who was known to be, dropped into occupied territory to go into a particular building, get something out of the safe because he was a master
Right.
safe cracker. And it turns out that on that ledger that John Trump had,
Mm-hmm.
that Willis George was listed as a civilian investigator, which even Trump found curious. And when they were doing this back and forth, they sent Trump actually to two places. One was a warehouse, one was a hotel. But it's been speculated that Willis George beat him to the hotel by 30 minutes and that there may have been safe cracking activity that was going on there. At least it's my conclusion that that's the reason he would beat him there. No one else has suggested he got the records.
Okay.
As soon as Tesla dies
Mm-hmm.
and they call Vannevar Bush through the FBI, calls John Trump into action. That's his
Mm-hmm.
protege.
Mm-hmm.
And he says he's the man you can trust. They put together a little team around Trump.
Mm-hmm.
So he doesn't get to select them. And a few of them are, intel types, and a few of them, one's called a civilian investigator. When John Trump investigates, he finds out that that guy is a former OSS agent,
Mm-hmm.
and it raises his own suspicions. Now, we know he puts out this kind of blasé statement that after reviewing these records, it turns out to me that although he had a lot of speculation, he really had nothing about a death ray or whatever. And it's interesting, it's interesting to note that John Trump actually, at the interview in the end of his life, said the FBI asked me to look for technology that could take flying objects down at a distance.
Mm-hmm.
So my question for you is, with this Willis George aspect, there was a major piece around this where the diplomats, et cetera, said there are German spies who want that intel. And so the Trump group is kind of like a secondary group, and maybe Willis George uses the access of that to get to that safe early and get the information.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Mm-hmm.
at least it's an element there. Or did they get the intel anyway and work it through these various systems? Or did Willis George represent some kind of a faction in between, a third actor who was trying to get their hands on this?
Oh, that's quite a tall drink of water. I absolutely believe that somebody got to Tesla's papers before John
Okay.
Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you why. Years and years ago, back in the mid 80s, there was a author of thriller novels by the name of Louis Perdue, Perdue. He wrote not that many novels, but they were real corkers. Let me tell you. If you want to sit down and read a novel that reads like headlines, his
Oh
novels
wow.
are it. And one of his novels was titled "The Tesla Bequest" or "The Tesla Papers," I forget which, and it's precisely about uh, the fact that Tesla's papers were stolen, and he gets into this whole idea of death rays and so on and so forth. Well, we know Tesla talked about it because he published newspaper articles about it.
Yes, absolutely.
Would those articles have been inclusive of something capable of taking down a UFO? Well, this is where it gets interesting.
Yeah.
Because if you look at what Tesla's doing in his Colorado Springs experiments, and then as he's building Wardenclyffe and coming up with all these other ideas about robots and particle beams and so on and so forth, Tesla, I strongly suspect, realized that arcs, heavy, high duty, high voltage, direct current arcs, okay, lightning, basically, all right. Lightning gives off, most people don't know this, but a lightning strike will give off a sudden burst of gamma rays as the arc is collapsing the and ionizing the molecules of air that's moving through. So you get all these gamma ray bursts during thunderstorms. Tesla experimenting, with his artificial lightning bolts is going to be enough of a scientist to investigate the phenomenon. Now, why is this significant? Because if you can control that gamma burst, what happens to any electronic equipment hit with it? Well, that gamma ray burst is your electromagnetic pulse. That's
Mm.
exactly what it is. So that's going to turn off any electrical machinery, like a UFO, that you
Ah.
hit it with. So would they be interested in Tesla and all of his notes that he's been making about all these wild phenomena? For you betcha they would.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah.
let's not forget one final little close a clue that no one, to my knowledge, Daniel, ever mentions. Tesla's technology, his broadcast power technology, I think, was used during World War One with the American Expeditionary Force between Woodrow Wilson in Washington and John Pershing over in France.
Ah.
How? It was a very low frequency broadcast system using Tesla's system with the planet itself as the medium of communication.
Incredible.
So they were sending signals back and forth to each other, and this, the reason why I'm mentioning this was a mystification to the British and French
Mm-hmm.
as to how Pershing was getting communications so quickly and
Ah.
efficiently. They've got their big transmitters too, but they're not using Tesla's system to do it. And this is
Right.
what I suspect is going on in World War One. We were using some very simple, rudimentary form of Tesla's broadcast system to make communications between this country and Europe during the First World War possible. So would that be classified? You betcha.
Oh yeah.
You betcha.
Why should they share it with the world
Why
in
should
fact?
they share it? Precisely. Precisely. So yeah, I suspect all of the above is true. Um, I also suspect that President Trump knows a heck of a lot more than he's talking about. I mean,
Yeah.
come on, Uncle John Trump, Roy Cohn, come
Yeah.
on.
But Uncle John, which we put on the record with Vannevar Bush heading up the UFO file,
Mhm.
sends in his guy
Mm-hmm.
to get the Tesla papers. So you have the UFO file
Right.
and the Tesla papers in one individual. Now it's interesting. There's an article, and I'll just state this briefly to get your reaction. There's an article by a guy named Ron Rosenbaum, who wrote for Slate and was a super liberal. And he writes about how in the 80s he was writing this magazine article, and it was supposedly to trash Trump, who was coming up. The rumor was Trump has a solution to our nuclear problems. 1987. And Trump sits down with him at the 21 Club in New York, and he says, first of all, I've been communicating at a very high level. I'm working with the Doomsday Network in the Reagan White House.
Mm-hmm.
So he's working with COG people
Mm-hmm.
back then. My guess is his entree into that world is that his uncle is John Trump. Well, who does he mention in the middle of the conversation? This is according to Rosenbaum, who's, basically like a liberal hater, but he goes back and he takes out this article and he remembers this conversation. And Trump says, you should have known about my Uncle John. He just passed away. He got the Presidential Medal for scientific accomplishment. You should have known him because he knew all the solutions to nuclear
Mm-hmm.
and how we can use something that'll render nuclear to a zero option and all this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that's Trump in 1987. Does that give us a clue? He's
Oh, yeah.
already beaming about Uncle John and all the rest of it and being invited into COG meetings at the White House.
Well,
so obviously Trump doesn't come off as just your real estate mogul.
no.
I mean, this is a intergenerational thing with him and his scientific knowledge.
Well, if his uncle had some sort of clue or suspicion about a technology that would render nuclear weapons obsolescent, and was talking about zero option, then that puts the whole Reagan Gorbachev Reykjavik summit into perspective, because that's what those two were talking about.
Yes.
And the part of it that most people are forgetting is Gorbachev would never have sat down and eliminated all of the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons unless it did not have something to replace them with.
Exactly.
So, here's these two. Oh, well, we don't need these things anymore.
How about a zero option?
How about a zero option? We've got these other cute toys now to play with. So I'm not a bit surprised, and that Trump himself, you just don't look. There's three things about Trump that drives me nuts about people when they think of him.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, they forget about his uncle John Trump. Number two, they forget about Roy Cohn.
Yes.
And number three, they forget about what he did on 9/11.
Right.
He takes his engineers along with him as he himself goes around close to ground zero on and after 9/11 and has his engineers gathering all this information about what just happened. Why is he doing that? Well, my suspicion is that for someone involved, as he has been most of his life, in constructing high-rise buildings, and all sorts of other stuff, that something struck him as just not quite right with the public narrative about 9/11, and he's going to go down there and do his own investigating, by golly, and that's what he does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think the guy knows a heck of a lot more than he has said, particularly about things like exotic technology, golden defenses for missile defense, and so on and so forth. There's also the other aspect that his uncle is going to, with his presence at MIT, is going to be up to date on all the current latest information technology and theory.
Right.
So it's not accidental that Trump's big, beautiful bait and switch bill has all of this stuff about artificial intelligence, because this plays a key role in any defense system, any surveillance system that he's planning to build out. Absolutely key role. it's going to be interesting now, I think, to watch what Russia and China do. And by the way, Japan.
Oh, right.
Yeah, Japan.
Who want a shield against North Korea?
Who not only want a shield with North Korea, but Mrs. Abe, Shinzo Abe's widow, just went to the Kremlin.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
For what?
A pleasant visit.
Oh, wow.
Now, if you're buying that one, bonsai, as they say.
Yeah. Abe's assassinated, friend to the United States, and then
Friend.
Yeah.
Friend.
And then his widow making overtures to the Kremlin. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, just within the last 2 to 3 weeks.
Amazing.
She visited the Kremlin. Now, that does not happen.
Mm-hmm.
The Japanese don't do this.
Yeah.
Neither do the Russians,
Right.
They, we're told that they exchanged pleasantries. No, what this is was she was restarting or trying to revivify Shinzo Abe's diplomacy with Russia. And, if ever there's a geopolitical wedding, a match made perfect, it's Japan and Russia right now.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Absolutely. Japan's got all that nifty technology. Russia has all that nifty military technology and lots of energy that Japan could use, and it's right next door.
Right.
No worries about Chinese interdiction there, folks.
They have a long history of warring with each other, Japan and Russia.
They do.
Yeah.
But let's remember what set up that war. And by the way, I talk about it a bit in the new book.
The new book, which is we should mention is a dual set.
It's a dual set.
The first set is the first one of the set is Rialto and Richmond.
Yeah.
And the Mysteries of the Civil War. That's part one.
And
then part two, Rialto and Richmond Reconstructed, Confederates, Canada, and Carpetbaggers. Yeah. Everything is touched upon in there, from a secret system of finance, airships, intrigues around the assassination. Even the Wizard of Oz is featured in there.
Yeah. No, it's Japan was kickstarted into world powerdom by Great Britain for a specific reason. And that gets into part 2 of the book, and I don't want to talk about it. I want people to read it and suddenly realize what a big, huge game everything was back then.
Yeah, what we'll do, since it just came out, is we'll do a special show on both books after people have had a chance to digest it.
Yeah,
for sure. But what I found interesting is that you brought the airship piece in there, and again, we're kind of bedazzled here throughout history with things that just don't make sense. And here's a big one that doesn't make sense that we've touched on a number of different occasions, which is the amount of technology available in the 19th century and the record of it.
Yes.
Which far surpasses the Wright brothers and all that.
Oh, yeah. So Bosley was the one that pointed out this airship connection, and he's been doing so consistently for a number of years. And there's another book by Michael Busby about the great airship mystery of the late 19th century.
Yes, that's an excellent book.
It's a superb book. And one of the things that he points out in that book, and I mentioned in Rialto number 1, is that during the war between the states, an American inventor that was involved with these airships and actually produced one that witnesses say flew off under its own power and direction at over 200 miles an hour.
Wow. Solomon.
Yeah. And that's not just a dirigible, folks.
Wow.
If it's able to be controlled and directed and flying that fast, that's more than a Hindenburg. We don't know what it was, but it was demonstrated to officers of the Union. And here's the kicker: President Lincoln himself wanted Congress, and Congress actually did fund research into that man's airship technology. Any weapon just to get rid of these problem Confederates. Just give us something.
Wonder weapon.
Yeah, wonder weapon.
1860s
In
style.
1860s style. And, we forget that this was going on, at that period. Both belligerents in the Civil War did use observation balloons as part of their reconnaissance capability. So, it shouldn't surprise us that one or the other or both of them are going to be delving into any sort of secret research that they can do.
Right.
So I'm not surprised at it at all.
Mm-hmm.
What I did in the first part of Rialto was simply suggest a funding mechanism for it based on what Busby himself says in his book, that this whole effort could have been funded by greenbacks.
Off the record.
Well, my suspicion is that when there's a whole series of financial legislation after the war between the states, and I don't want to review it now because that takes up a lot of the second book. But one of the things that's done in those financial legislations is that more or less the greenback is reconverted into a different kind of currency, and much of it is taken out of circulation. And it's that taken out of circulation that is the thing that, to me, raises suspicion, because, the Federal Reserve regularly burns millions, if not billions of dollars worth of currency. But much of that currency that's removed from circulation and slated to be destroyed is for a period of time shunted into the intelligence communities to fund covert operations and projects.
Right.
That's how it's done.
Right.
So this is what I suspect happened, is they used this as a funding mechanism, because that airship research, those sightings continued for long after the end of the war. So somebody was getting money from somewhere to do this stuff. The other source of the money I don't want to get into. It's another one of those whopper doozies.
Well, you've got you mentioned Bosley there, and he has the incredible tapestry of the Nimza Group.
Right.
They're in Germany, but they come over here and they send one of their spies, Delschau, to take a look at this Sonora Aero group. And they basically, the idea, I think, is that they wanted to somehow weaponize it, and there's resistance there.
Permettez-moi to dangle.
Yes, please.
Dangle a couple of tidbits out there. Delschau ain't the only kraut over here during the period. In fact, there's two more with really, really well-known surnames that are over here, and you wouldn't believe what they're doing. All I can say is, if you believe that they're over here on purely coincidence, I have another coincidence theory to sell you after I sell you a bridge in Brooklyn cheap.
What do we have for the surnames?
I really don't want to ruin it for people.
I think it'll just give a glint to go further.
I'll give you one of them.
Okay.
Von Richthofen. Does that surname ring a bell?
What is that surname?
Manfred von Richthofen was the Red Baron in World War I.
Yes.
Wolfram von Richthofen was a relative of his that was a Luftwaffe Colonel General in World War II. So, but there's a relative here during the Civil War, and I ain't gonna tell you what he's doing.
Oh wow! So this is the covert development in the background.
Oh, huge!
Yeah,
huge.
Huh.
huge. Daniel, I'm still flabbergasted. I tell people I wrote that book in a hot flash. I did. Because I uncovered all this stuff and I thought, my God, this goes real deep.
Mm-hmm.
This goes hugely deep. And
Yeah.
we've got all of these players over here doing all of this stuff, and no one's written about it, and
Well, that's
no one's
yeah.
noticed it. And when you find out what they're doing, and then what was done to the country as they're doing what they're doing.
Mm. Yeah, airships will help you do that.
Airships will help you do that. This is the John Trump mystery version 1.0, 19th century
Mm.
style. And the continuity of government operation going on,
Mm-hmm.
in at the end of the Civil War is also breathtaking.
Mm-hmm.
Jefferson Davis isn't a fanatic wandering around the Carolinas, trying to keep the cause going like we've been taught in the history books. No, that's not at all what he's doing.
Now he
Not
goes
at
right
all.
back into the establishment, doesn't he? Well, he sells insurance first.
He goes, yeah, he lives out the rest of his days. He writes his memoirs and he moves to New Orleans, eventually ends up there, and is involved in insurance. But the problem with Jefferson Davis at the end of the war is what he's up to.
Mm-hmm.
Why is this man not tried for treason?
Right. As you would assume, that's what they would do.
And then, I've got his memoirs. I found them being sold in a local bookstore when I was doing my master's work in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I found The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government by Jefferson Davis in a little local bookstore. I thought, oh my word, I got to have that. So I bought it and I read his memoirs. Fascinating reading.
Interesting.
And the interesting thing about his memoirs is not so much what he talks about, but what he doesn't talk about.
Mm. And he's leaving out his connection with this transportation group, shall we say?
He's leaving out all of that. He says nothing, not one word about Confederate finances. I mean, how do you fight a war for 4 years like they were doing on a rattle trap system of currency that they were that they were working with? How do you
You've
do
mentioned
it?
before that on their currency itself, it said to be paid
Yeah,
based on the outcome of the war,
yeah.
and that they had some sort of secret stash of gold,
I
perhaps?
I think, oh, it's more than that. And again, this is why the books have to be read together. On every Confederate circulating currency note, the back of them was blue, so I call them bluebacks, like the Lincoln greenbacks were green. So on the front of every Confederate blueback, there was a little declaration that said something to the effect of such and such amount of time after the conclusion of a treaty of peace between the United States of America and the Confederate States of America, the Confederate States of America will pay to the bearer on demand X amount of dollars. That's what these declarations said. At the beginning of the war, the declarations were for like 6 months. Toward the middle of the war, it was 2 years. Toward the end of the war, it was 10 years. Okay, and that's an
Mhm.
important point. But yes, there's some source of funding, but more importantly, with all the stuff that's going on in the Civil War, we're looking at exactly the same problem that we're looking at now with
Right.
John Trump and Golden Domes and all of this secret research and all the financing required to give that secret research
Mhm.
and the surveillance system. We're looking at a vast, huge continuity of government operation.
Wow.
This is why I wrote those books, because the parallels are just too strong. The playbook is exactly the same. It's just
Incredible.
updated.
Yeah.
It's just updated.
Well, it's interesting too because of course COG is the least looked at
Mhm.
of anything because it requires, first of all, it's scant in terms of the information that's available,
Right.
but it requires you to go really deep. It's one thing for people to just say, "Oh, those billionaires have underground bunkers," whatever. How about a whole system
Yeah,
of
exactly.
government? It's a secondary governmental system
Yeah, exactly. It's
underground.
a whole
Yeah.
system, and this is the interesting thing that when you look at the end of the war between the states, this is exactly what you see. They're trying to set up a system,
Yeah.
and in a certain sense, they are successful in setting up that system.
Right.
And it's there is a sea change in the finances of this country in both sections, North and South, as a result of the war between the states. And the financial system that was there prior to the war completely evaporates after the war. And it's that system after the war that, like it or not, in one way, shape, or form, we're still living under now. It's been patched, it's been rebuilt in certain areas, and so on and so
Hmm.
forth. But it's essentially the same system.
Huh.
And it's
Yeah.
a large part of it was to go to support this technological infrastructure development secretly and covertly. So yeah, I'm now on board with Walter Bosley that we're pushing that whole thing back beyond World War II, past World War One, and back into the 19th century. It's definitely there, and it's definitely a huge factor of what's going on financially, politically, culturally. Uh, with what we see going on now with Trump and this sovereign wealth fund, and we're going to
Hmm.
create wealth out of cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
It is
Well, what
so
about that?
crystal
What
clear.
about that gold card for immigration, or the Golden Dome, the Golden
Bingo.
Age, the gold
Yeah,
card?
yeah.
We're going
Gold,
gold
gold,
here, folks.
gold. Yeah, it's Daniel. I'm so glad you pointed out the neuro linguistic programming going on around the word gold right now is off the charts.
Jesus.
And again, I'm looking at all this from the standpoint of the war between the states, and thinking, where have we heard this before?
Yeah.
What happened to silver? You
Yeah.
Where's
Yeah.
that? Where did that go? Why did it go?
Well, you
Um,
cite tremendous parallels between the JFK assassination and the Lincoln
oh,
assassination. Do
huge.
you want to go into a couple of those?
Yeah, sure. Um,
The Secret
John
Service part, I
John
thought.
Wilkes Booth. John
Yeah.
Wilkes Booth. How many of them are there?
Right. Right.
Um, when Booth was apprehended at Garrett's farm, he conveniently, I mean, you can't have a 19th century version of the Warren Report better than this. Okay. So he enters President Lincoln's box, which is unguarded
Right.
conveniently. So we have the security stripping around the
Yeah.
president.
Yes.
So John Wilkes Booth manages to enter Abraham Lincoln's box, walk up behind the president, take out a derringer and pop him behind the left ear, mafioso hit style, by
Yep.
the way. And then, as everybody in the theater is turning up to the box to what's going on up there, he leaps down from the presidential box down to the stage of the theater, injures his foot. We don't really know which one
Mhm.
because some witnesses say one and some say the other.
Ah.
As he shouts, "Sic semper tyrannis," he thus always to tyrants, which is the state motto of the state of Virginia.
Oh.
Oh,
Interesting.
interesting.
Yeah.
Then he runs out the back of the theater to a conveniently positioned horse and makes his way conveniently through all of the sentry lines around Washington, D.C., which are in the control of Edwin Stanton,
Well,
a, There's no other way to describe him, Daniel, other than as a turd in the punch bowl at intermission during an opera. I mean, this
Wow.
guy is a
Wow.
piece of work. So anyway, Booth eventually makes his way along with one of his cell members down to Garrett's farm in Maryland, where he is supposedly cornered in a barn by
Right.
Union forces who managed to shoot him through the barn as the
Right.
barn is on fire,
But not so much.
but not so much. And the bullet apparently goes through his spinal cord on his neck, leaves the man gasping in agony. They immediately drag him over to a tree out of the barn where he expires a little bit later.
Wow.
And then they take his body to an ironclad that's anchored nearby, and there his body sits and rots, waiting to be identified. And this is where
Wow.
it gets interesting, because they bring all these people that supposedly knew Booth personally. I mean, the man was well known. He was an actor.
Right.
So he was known publicly on both sides of the lines. That should tell you something during the war.
Right.
They get a doctor that had actually removed a tumor from the back of Booth's neck.
Yes.
And the doctor is looking at this corpse, and they try no less than 3 times to alter the doctor's testimony to identify this as being John Wilkes Booth, which eventually he does, in spite of the fact that there's no mention of Booth's tattoos that he had on his hands. There's no
Ah.
mention of any of the scarring that Booth suffered from injuries taken during mock duels on stage. And best of all, the guy that is being identified as Booth's corpse has freckles.
Oh, wow. No way.
Booth does not.
That's not Booth.
So it's not Booth. Okay. And I put a little picture of John Wilkes Booth and a close lookalike in the book to show you that even with Lincoln, we have the same problem. Security stripping the president.
Mhm.
Remember, the president was supposed to go to the theater that night with General and Mrs. Grant,
Oh, right.
who are warned out of Washington, D.C., and not to go to the theater by the Secretary of War. Okay.
Yeah.
Daniel, it goes on and on. But the bottom line is we have all of the problems with Lincoln's assassination as we have with Kennedy's assassination.
Mhm.
And golly gosh, isn't it interesting that both presidents had a similar financial policy?
Yes. Yeah. So somehow the activity is related to the issuing of the currency
Yeah.
somehow.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
what you're using that currency for.
yes, yes.
Yes.
And that advanced weaponry is going on in the 1860s and certainly in the 1960s.
Yeah, Lincoln wants that airship technology, and he's issuing direct orders to Edwin Stanton to get it. And again, this is the same Secretary of War that's
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
the center of every other web that's going on. So yeah,
Well,
there are so many parallels. It's not
that's
even
incredible.
yeah.
Yeah. It's remarkable too because those things repeating in history, Lincoln is such a Kennedy figure in this
Yes,
sense. They're both transformative figures, and they
yes.
both need to be removed by this deep state situation.
And
Here's
they're
an
both killed
intrigue.
on Friday.
Oh, both killed on Friday. Yes, and not to mention the incredibly strange
Uh-huh.
series of coincidences related to both of their deaths.
Yep.
As a matter of fact, one of the things about Booth that's interesting is there's been this long running thing over here by Harvard that he's buried close by to here, and that there's a person, a researcher, who's been trying to dig up that body and test the DNA, which is, I'm sure you're aware of all those things, but
Uh-huh.
Harvard again, where
Well, there's a Booth that supposedly died in Enid, Oklahoma, toward
yes,
the end of the 19th century. So there's lots of John Wilkes Booths around there,
yeah, yeah,
which raises the stakes considerably as to what exactly is going on. And you know, the interesting
Witness protection program.
well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And when you really dig into the Lincoln assassination, um, the same sorts of footprints of intelligence activity are there with that as you see with Kennedy. It is
Mhm,
crystal clear, and it will be much clearer when people read the second book. You cannot avoid it at that point.
mhm,
They're just all over the place. But the same motivations of people. You see the same types of people involved. With Kennedy, we have basically a cadre or core of corrupt people in
mhm,
his own government that are plotting the
mhm.
president's demise, including his own vice president.
Right. Yeah.
With Lincoln, we have people in his own government, in his own administration that are clearly, and his own political party, that are clearly plotting against him. And on top of that, although I do not think he was involved, his vice president, coincidentally, another Vice President Johnson,
Right.
John Wilkes Booth did something very interesting on the day that President Lincoln was murdered. He went to the hotel where Vice President Johnson stayed and called on him. And when he didn't get an answer from Johnson, he left his calling card to the hotel clerk to give to Vice President Johnson with his little signed message: stop by, didn't see you, hope to see you, John Wilkes Booth, blah, blah, blah. Which
Oh,
is led,
wow.
oh yeah, it's just very bizarre. So
Hmm.
you have the same types of people involved in getting rid of Kennedy, pardon me, of Lincoln, as you did Kennedy. And one final thing. One of the speculations about President Kennedy that most people have entertained, I certainly entertain it, and I think there's a lot of merit to it, is the idea that President Kennedy saw no path forward or no national interest at stake in conducting a massive war in Vietnam,
Oh,
and
yeah.
that he was planning to pull out of Vietnam. So in other words, Kennedy was defying the military industrial complex with that war, and this was a motivation for his murder. Turn back to Lincoln. What most people don't know is that at the end, I do talk about this a great deal in the second book, and I can mention this aspect of things here because it is a matter of public record. And if you really know the details of the war between the states, you're already familiar with this. But President Lincoln and President Davis both attempted a peace conference at the very tail end of the war between the states.
Mm.
Davis actually sent commissioners to a peace conference with Lincoln to meet personally with Lincoln and personally with his Secretary of State Seward. And that conference did occur.
Mhm.
I'm not going to go into details about it, but it's interesting that when news got out in Washington that President Lincoln had met with Confederate delegates to try and end the war, the radical Republicans in the House of Representatives absolutely blew up in a hysteria of purpled rage. Some of his party in the Senate wanted immediately to impeach Lincoln, and on we go.
Oh, wow.
So, in other words, both presidents are shot by members of their own government after making their views on peace perfectly clear.
Wow.
Wow, that's a wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a
They're
wow.
gonna they're gonna stifle,
Yep.
and that whole machine is not gonna be realized, the
Right.
military adventurism.
Right.
And, it's interesting because when we get stuck with Johnson in the 1860s, you get all of those problems that bring us So they basically you kind of like reboot to pre-Civil War style conditions. It's very
You
strange.
reboot to, yes, and I think that's deliberate.
Yeah.
You reboot, as a Southern Democrat, you reboot that whole thing.
Yeah.
And Johnson Johnson is essentially trying to carry out and conduct the Reconstruction policies that Lincoln wanted.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's all sorts of background here, but to me, it's very interesting that this is yet another one of these parallels between these two famous assassinations, less than 100 years apart from each other. And in
Mm.
that time, the playbook didn't change all that much.
Wow, incredible.
Yeah, it's
That we get posse comitatus out of
yeah,
that as
yes,
well, which
exactly,
is
yes.
we'll agree to like get the feds out of the states. Thank you very much.
Well, there's a reason that it passes after that period. There's a reason why posse comitatus comes after Reconstruction.
Uh-huh.
Most Americans don't even know the ghastly things that were done in the name of Reconstruction. It's just truly ghastly.
Oh wow. Yeah.
I have a book, Daniel, in my collection of books, that is nothing but a collection of photographs of black and white poor people in the postbellum South, all through the 19th century and on up into the early 20th century. And it is appalling.
Kept in a state of utter poverty.
Utter poverty and debt peonage.
Oh
Just
wow.
unreal. And it is heartrending. And these pictures were actually done during the administration of Franklin Roosevelt. The government
Mm.
did a study, and it was a photographic study of Southern. It's just appalling. It's just appalling.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Well, it's fascinating because Kennedy does attempt to address this in relation to Appalachian things with the whole
Yep.
anti-poverty efforts.
Yes, he does.
It's very interesting the parallels there because you're taking on the same system,
Hmm.
but the system goes on in perpetuity,
Yep.
and it's just the means and the methods that it acquires. That battle, that dance, continues to go on. I wanted to invite you to comment on an intrigue based on your own work in the
Hmm.
area.
Hmm.
And this relates to three things. It relates to the Kennedy assassination, the weapons used, the Roswell incident,
Hmm.
and the general idea of space weapons.
Okay.
So here's how we go. So, and Roswell itself is a location, and it also there's a double or two in there too.
All right.
So I found out, and I did an episode recently called Roswell Reignited.
Hmm.
And the reason it's reignited is because I came across information that the officer that found the weapon, which he first identified as a 7.65 Mauser in
Right.
the
Yes.
Texas School Book Depository, Eugene Boone,
Hmm.
24-year-old deputy sheriff.
Hmm.
Um, he went in there, and that was his first affidavit that he put in there.
That was
And
a Mauser.
yes, the Mauser,
Right.
7.65, and, of course, we know that Roger Craig and
Yes.
then Seymour Weitzman. So 3 of the first respondents, that's what they reported.
Right.
And in Craig's case, he said, but, they all were like, "Oh, it's 7.65."
Mauser. Right.
Yeah, it's printed
Stamp
on
on the barrel
yes,
or
yeah,
some part of the
on the
gun.
barrel,
Yeah.
exactly. The other thing is that there is one of those runs a gun store. I think it's
Yes.
Weitzman who
I
runs the
think it
gun
was
store.
Weissman.
So
Yeah.
he would know, yeah.
Right.
So we have the weapon piece. Now, Boone, when I went into his history, Boone is somebody who would leave the police department and go to run the foster children's homes in Texas for the same fosters that owned the Roswell Ranch.
Oh, you're kidding.
No. And that's on the record now because I've done the research and put it out there.
Holy cow.
So this guy he becomes the CEO of the foster homes. And the Fosters who own not only these cattle ranches, but a lot of big oil there in Texas.
Uh-huh.
They face a situation when the Roswell crash happens, which is when they go up there, the first thing that happens is Mac Brazel, who's their ranch hand. He runs the ranch, but he doesn't own it. And he calls him up and says, "You got problems." And people witness that call. Fosters come up, they get their talking to, and supposedly the talking to goes something like this: "We want the ranch. We need it all. Sell it to us because of this incident." And they originally refuse, and then little by little they're bought off with mineral rights. And I've also heard a gold mine. But the mineral rights is something that's sort of cascading through the literature. And they become incredibly well off. I mean, they were already doing quite well.
Right.
And then they become, and they run, they're part of the, yes,
Campbell.
Church of Christ.
Campbell.
And
Okay. Yeah.
they're the ones, the only, one way to identify them is they don't allow instruments in the
Yeah,
church.
I know who they are. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very interesting group. And all of the people who work for the Fosters are members.
Right. Okay.
So that gives them, I guess, kind of a good network there.
Mhm.
And so by the time we get our friend Boone there running everything, we've got this situation where the Fosters don't ever talk about the incident again. However, later on in the literature, like the grandkids talked a little bit about how transformed the grandparents were by the whole thing. So we have some of those things on the record, in fact. And a lot of unusual things happen in terms of Brazel's family. Like one of his kids disappear. He goes to Alaska. He gets out of there. And one of his kids disappears. And then that's it. It's a missing person. Oddly enough, 30 years later, turns out that he just went to Montana and changed his identity and died there. A suicide. So there's a lot of weird things around the incident that weren't really, it's hard to connect what those dots are. Now, there's the whole book that this Major Vinson put out, who was an Air Force major, and he wrote something about being going into Dallas, and he went there. He was getting this whole transport back to Colorado Springs, and he worked at NORAD. And he gets on this plane, and he's asking, "What plane can I use?" And they give him this weird plane to get on. It's a C-54, and the logo is an egg. And it looks like the Earth is an egg shape with these grids through it. So long story short, what happens is while he's on the plane, someone gets on the plane who looks exactly like Oswald, along with the tall Cuban.
Now wait a minute. He's flying from Dallas to NORAD?
To Colorado Springs. That's where NORAD was at the time. Yeah. So he takes this move and he gets on, and he came from Andrews. So he went from Andrews. He was heading to Colorado Springs. And what happens is when he gets on at Andrews, he gets on, and it's this weird plane with a logo. And so the plane is taking him from Andrews in D.C. all the way to Colorado Springs. But about 12:29, a voiceover comes up and says, "We're diverting. The president has just been shot." And they turn the plane around, and it lands near the Trinity River. Now, when it lands in this unexpected landing, he's the only person on the plane except for the pilot and co-pilot, by the way. And they don't say anything to him when they get on. So the plane lands and two people get on. One of them is in construction overalls, and the other one is similarly dressed. One is a tall Cuban, and the other one, according to this guy, is Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, he's very confused by the situation.
Yeah.
And when they get on, they don't say anything to him. They go right up to the cockpit. And then the plane goes into the air, and he's like, "Where are we even going?" And so it lands, and they run out, these two, the Oswald double and this Cuban. They literally go right past him. The pilots go right past him and don't say anything. And he's just sitting there on this plane. So he gets out, and he looks for some person to talk to. And there's an MP in a little office with a light. He goes in there, and he said it was dusk. And he said, "Where am I?" And the guy said, "You're in Roswell Air Force Base." And he said, "Well, I'm supposed to go to Colorado Springs." He said, "Well, you're not getting anywhere. All these bases have been locked down because of the assassination, so you're going to have to just hang out." And he does. And eventually he gets a bus to go to another location, and the bus takes him up to Colorado Springs. That's his story, and he kept it for years and years. He
How
tried to
weird.
give it to the Assassination Record Review Board.
They wouldn't take it?
They wouldn't take it because of the Roswell mention.
Oh, for crying out loud.
Wow. So here's a double. Here's a Roswell connection
Yeah.
after the assassination, and there's Boone in the middle of all this, finding the rifle, and he works for the Foster Ranch people.
You don't make up a story like this.
No.
No.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah, it is.
So with, and I've put my take about Roswell and everything else, but I know what you have about Roswell and the Reich. I've spent many hours with your book.
Uh-huh.
If you combine all these circumstances, what are you getting out of those peculiar connections?
Well, number one, that they're taking such pains to buy the Foster Ranch and essentially silence them.
Yes.
What that tells me, I mean, that area of New Mexico, I don't know if you've ever been to it, but that area of New Mexico is a whole lot of nothing.
Yeah. I've been to Albuquerque and Santa Fe, but this is further over.
I mean, this is a whole lot of nothing.
Yeah.
It's just so to go to those lengths tells me that one of the things that possibly it indicates is that the crash site itself was very large.
Yes.
Not the little contained thing that most people have in their mind.
Mm-hmm.
So that's number one. Number two, the other thing it tells me is that there's something extremely odd either about it. Maybe they did find strange bodies. Who knows? I'm not a believer in the bodies narrative, but for various reasons, not the least of which is they can't get the story to come down to an agreed data set. But whatever it was that they're finding or that was found there, they're worried that something else might still be there. I don't know.
Oh yeah.
And then to the part of the thing that mystifies me is if you've got a soldier working at NORAD who is on a flight from DC to Colorado Springs, they divert to Dallas, they pick up a Lee Harvey Oswald double, and then fly on to Roswell.
Yeah.
What that's suggesting to me is that somehow that base and the whole story connected with it is part of this whole Kennedy assassination story in some fashion.
Yes.
That has never been adequately disclosed or investigated.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes to the basic thesis in Roswell and the Reich that it had something to do with advanced space or aeronautic technology.
Right.
And it may have had something to do with nuclear weapons as well, since that was a nuclear weapons space as well. But that's just very bizarre and weird. All the weirdness around both Roswell and Kennedy, that's just plain weird.
It's interesting because it's kind of a weird addendum to the whole thing. Vincent goes on the year later.
I don't think it's no. Hang on, just a minute. I wouldn't qualify it as an addendum. I think it's a central issue.
Mm-hmm.
It's an indicator that there's much more here than meets the eye, and these are little tidbits.
Yes.
It's not an appendix.
Mm-hmm.
It's a major. My guess is it's a major chapter of the story.
Yes, absolutely.
What's interesting also about it is that if this is appearing in books that appeared in 70 or 80, you showed it earlier. My question is, why didn't the so-called big names of Roswell research, Stanton Friedman and Kevin Randall and people like that?
Oh yeah, the whole group.
Yeah, why did they miss it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's extraordinary. It's left out of all the Roswell literature,
Yeah.
and it's not celebrated in the JFK literature because it
Yeah,
includes
I didn't know
UFO.
anything about it, and again, I've never encountered the story either in Roswell connection or in JFK connection. So my question really is then why was it missed? Um,
Exactly.
back at that time, you would have had various guides, analog guides that could have summarized literature on these things.
Mhm.
Um, so why was it missed? Was it not cataloged? Was it not entered into Reader's Guide of Periodical Literature and so on and so forth? Did no one ever review it? Uh,
Mhm.
that raises a lot of questions.
It's pushed out,
Yeah,
of the literature on both sides,
yeah. Yeah.
and it's not accepted by the official body of the ARRB. They don't want it. Even with the guy's impeccable background, and he went on, by the way, to be recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency to work at Area 51.
Hey, he's
How's
good
that for
enough for
follow-up?
us, but not for you guys. No, you're on to something here.
Yeah.
There's no doubt in my mind. I mean, I've been around research like of this sort for long enough to know when you're onto something and when you're not, and you're
Yeah.
definitely onto something.
Wow,
Uh,
fascinating.
um,
The Foster Ranch,
yeah,
uh,
that whole
that
thing.
connection, so unusual.
Yeah, they don't just come in and buy a whole ranch. A lot of nothing. Um, they're my guess is that they probably ran more uh, post Roswell incident cleaning missions. In other words, they went back in, they sent other teams back in after all the attention had died down to find any other debris that might have been left by those initial debris cleaning missions.
Right,
It would not
right.
surprise me a bit.
Do you think that, that is fascinating? An intrepid little Roswell researcher found out about the ranch, that the status of the ranch in 1948 got changed to a toxic level where you couldn't raise animals on it and you couldn't raise different types of crops on it because of the toxic identification that it had.
In 48,
In 48, a year later.
yeah, but they don't specify what the toxicity was.
No, no. But it's interesting because it's that same level that you would get, if like a toxic spill had happened, something major had occurred there. And so for the people who would own it in perpetuity, and it switched around in quite a few hands, oddly enough, all those people couldn't grow plants on it, couldn't grow crops on it, and couldn't herd sheep.
Well, any look that again, that area of New Mexico is not known for a lot of crop growing. I mean, it's at best scrub. So, in other words, what they're really saying is, don't let any of your animals eat any of these plants, and don't eat any of your animals that do eat these plants.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah,
which, which, so in other words, they're buying the ranch because it's a toxic spill.
yes,
So that means whatever caused the toxic spill was caused by the crash
exactly.
and something found in it. And right off the top of my head, I can think of lots of stuff that might be found in Nazi technology that you wouldn't want your animals eating.
Ah,
Ah, ah,
yeah.
things like thorium oxide, mercury thorium oxide.
Mhm,
It's probably not the best thing to ingest. Um,
mhm.
yeah, I can think of a lot of. I can think
Highly toxic.
very, very,
Huh. Yeah.
very, and you wouldn't want animals exposed to it. So yeah, that whole thing gives the exotic technology twist to the whole thing another little bit of loose confirmation.
Well, we always knew because of Marcel,
Hmm.
because of the character of Marcel,
Hmm.
that it was not a mistake on his part.
No.
And that nonsense, the cover story is as bad as the lone gunman cover story in
Yeah.
history.
Yeah.
That's one. But then two, we also knew from all the strange things he described that it was something major and that he was familiar with all different types of aircraft.
Yeah.
Had been a pilot since 1928, in
Yeah.
fact. So he would have been very familiar with it, and that he was also not only in charge of intelligence for the base, but security.
Yep.
So we're in a whole different ballgame there with Marcel when he comes upon it and his original
Yeah.
description. And of course, they make him give the phony explanation of a weather balloon at the news conference, and he has to button his lip. And the story hangs out for 32 years in complete silence.
Yeah. Well, the story never made sense to me.
Yeah.
And by the way, I don't remember who it was, but in the photographs of General Ramey and Jesse Marcel with the so-called debris, there's a little folded up scrap of paper, the telegram. Have you heard about that?
Yes.
Someone
Yes. Yes.
someone blew it up and deciphered that whole
Talks
telegram.
about a crash.
Yeah, and blew all that weather balloon nonsense
Yeah.
out of the water. But no,
Wow.
what the Army Air Force was asking us to believe was that they had an intelligence officer and chief of security at the country's only nuclear air base that was a complete ninny.
Right.
Okay, guys,
That
that
weather
that
balloon.
just doesn't that dog
Oops.
doesn't hunt.
Wow. And they still use weather balloons as the most ridiculous excuse. It's like a fallback position for a psyop. It's
Well, it's
interesting,
becoming an
though.
excuse now. Now the latest version of the balloon thing was the mogul balloon, and
Yes, right. That nonsense about Project Mogul. Oh, it was an experimental balloon. And guess what? We had these dummies, crash test dummies that we would drop,
no, I listen. After all their explanations, I'd sooner believe the dead lizards with the beaded skin and the 3D version of the incident than the military explanations of it, because they just make no sense.
Mhm.
And the more you think about what they're trying to fob off on the public, the more you really realize that it doesn't make any sense.
Joseph, absolutely fascinating. Stay right there, and we'll do another hour for Dark Journalist subscribers to be available soon. You can become a member at darkjournalist.com. Of course, all of Joseph's work is available at GizaDeathStar.com, including his latest, Rialto Enrichment. Join us on Friday evenings at 8 p.m. Eastern for the Dark Journalist X series, right here. See you soon.